The Great Hall of the Velith Dominion did not simply exist as a room. It breathed as a colossal, sentient organism. Stepping into the throne room was like descending into the depths of a luminous, frozen ocean. The floor beneath Micah Rourke's heavy, steel-toed boots was a translucent expanse of shifting, bioluminescent crystal, reacting in real time to the micro-vibrations of the thousands of assembled nobles. High above, the vaulted ceiling was an inverted abyss where massive, crystalline rings floated in anti-gravity fields, expanding and contracting in perfect, hypnotic rhythm. It was a visual, overwhelming representation of the royal heartbeat, a flawless metronome that dictated the pulse of an empire spanning over 300 star systems. Micah was, by all observable metrics, decidedly not flawless. He was a human resonance technician, currently sporting a dark smear of hydrocoolant across his left cheek and wearing an insulated utility suit that had seen better decades. He had been contracted to accompany the United Earth diplomatic envoy for exactly one reason: the Velith atmospheric scrubbers in the guest wing were emitting a high-frequency, subharmonic whine that was giving the human ambassadors crippling migraines. He was getting paid 85 credits an hour to hit intricate alien pipes with a specialized density wrench. His shift was supposed to end in exactly 45 minutes. Yet, here he was, standing dead center in the most sacred and heavily guarded political arena in the known galaxy. He had been yanked out of a maintenance shaft by two heavily armored Velith royal guards exactly 14 minutes ago. They had frog-marched him silently past miles of immaculate, glowing corridors and shoved him out onto the crystalline floor without a single word of explanation. He did not know why he was here. He could see the Earth ambassador standing in the far elevated viewing gallery, gripping the railing so hard his knuckles were white, looking as though he were about to suffer a massive cardiac event. Micah swallowed hard, his grip tightening defensively on his diagnostic data pad. Around him, hundreds of Velith aristocrats towered like elegant, terrifying statues of marble and silver. They were breathtaking beings, impossibly tall and slender, their skin shimmering with subtle metallic hues, draped in flowing silks woven from what looked like pure starlight. Their collective gaze bore down on him, a heavy, suffocating mixture of aristocratic disdain, sheer confusion, and predatory curiosity. Micah calculated his odds of surviving the next 5 minutes and came up with a solid 0%. He supposed he ought to bow, or perhaps kneel. He scrambled his brain to remember the brief cultural etiquette packet he had skimmed on the transport ship 3 weeks ago. Was it the left knee to the floor, or the double chest tap? If he did it wrong, would they vaporize him on the spot before his brain could successfully send the signal to his legs? A streak of blinding white and gold tore through the immaculate, calculated order of the royal court. From the elevated dais that housed the towering crystalline thrones, Princess Leore moved. She did not walk. She seemed to glide. A sudden, violent disruption of the absolute stillness that defined Velith royalty. She bypassed the high priests of the resonance. She ignored the frantic, subtle hand gestures of her mother, Queen Nisara. She practically threw herself down the grand, sweeping staircase, her ceremonial silken robes billowing behind her like the wings of a diving raptor. Micah barely had time to brace his stance before she collided with him. It was not a formal greeting. It was not a diplomatic gesture. It was a desperate, crushing embrace. The princess of the Velith Dominion, the sole heir to a billion-year-old genetic dynasty, buried her face directly into the grease-stained, rough fabric of Micah's utility collar and wrapped her arms fiercely around his neck. If a tactical supernova had detonated inside the Great Hall, it might have caused slightly less shock. The silence that crashed down on the room was absolute, deafening, and violently heavy. It was not merely the sudden cessation of polite whispers. It was the terrified, synchronized halting of 1,000 breaths. In the rigid, perfection-obsessed culture of the Velith, the royal heir was practically a living deity. She was untouched, untouchable, physically isolated from the common masses and strictly barred from any physical contact with an outsider. To touch the princess meant instant, agonizing atomization by the royal guard. For the princess to willingly touch an outsider meant that the individual had been recognized by the life sigil of the throne itself. An ancient, mythical, and frankly, impossible rite. To see her hugging a dirty, low-tier human mechanic was a paradox that the hyper-advanced Velith aristocratic minds simply could not process. 4 high priests in the front row looked as if their primary nervous systems had just suffered a catastrophic hard crash. The Grand Marshal of the fleets froze mid-stride. His hand hovering over a ceremonial plasma blade, he suddenly did not know whether to draw, drop, or ignite. Micah stood entirely paralyzed. His arms were splayed out awkwardly to his sides, utterly useless, hovering in mid-air. His brain felt like it was packed with wet sand. He could smell sharp ozone and the scent of crushed alien wildflowers radiating from her hair. He felt the frantic, fluttering rhythm of her 2 hearts beating against his chest, completely out of sync with the majestic, slow pulse of the ceiling rings above them. He slowly lowered his hands, terrified that if he so much as brushed against her royal fabric, an orbital strike would vaporize him from the heavens. He cleared his throat. The sound echoed like a kinetic slug firing in the frozen cavern. Do we know each other?" Micah asked. It was a brutally mundane, horribly human question. Up in the diplomatic gallery, the Earth ambassador buried his face in his hands, silently praying for the floor to open up and consume him. The Velith nobles collectively swayed on their feet, politically suffocating on the sheer, unrefined audacity of the phrase. Princess Leore stepped back, but only half a pace. Her hands remained locked around his thick forearms, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so ethereal. Micah finally got a clear look at her face. Her eyes were pools of liquid quicksilver, and right now, they were wide, blazing with an intense, frantic light. It was the desperate look of someone who had been stranded in an endless, silent desert, and had just stumbled upon a roaring river. "You came back," Leore said, her voice a resonant, multi-layered chime that cut right through the suffocating silence of the hall. "I knew you were real," Micah blinked, utterly lost. He opened his mouth to explain that he had never been within 100 light-years of this sector until last Tuesday. But the palace itself decided to interrupt him. High above them, the massive, floating crystalline rings of the ceiling suddenly stopped their slow, golden-purple pulse. For a terrifying 2 seconds, the entire ocean of light within the grand chamber plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Then, a sound erupted from the very foundations of the planet. It was a deep, resonant hum, a bass frequency that bypassed the auditory canals and vibrated directly in the marrow of the bones. As the sound swelled into a deafening crescendo, the ceiling rings ignited once more, but not in their traditional, authorized colors. They flared into a blinding, ferocious shade of silver blue. A collective gasp ripped through the ranks of the nobility. Dozens of aristocrats fell to their knees. The priests collapsed entirely, pressing their faces to the floor. Silver blue was not just a color, it was a foundational myth. It was the absolute chromatic signature of the palace heart, the sentient, biological core of the planet, reacting to an event of monumental, destined importance. The heart was not malfunctioning. It was acknowledging the human. From the apex of the grand dais, the ambient temperature plummeted. Queen Nisara rose from her throne. She was a terrifying vision of absolute authority, a towering figure clad in crystalline armor and radiating cold, ruthless beauty. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped down from the dais. 1 step, 2 steps. Her ceremonial boots struck the crystalline floor with the sound of cracking ice. She did not speak, but the sheer, crushing weight of her presence pushed the air straight out of Micah's lungs. The royal guards, elite warriors bred for absolute fearlessness, visibly shrank back, terrified to even exhale as their sovereign descended into the fray. The Queen's eyes, a terrifying shade of abyssal black, were locked entirely on Micah. She looked as though she was debating whether to casually dissect him in a royal laboratory or throw him directly into a stellar incinerator. She stopped exactly 3 paces away. The blinding silver-blue light cascaded over her, casting sharp, imposing shadows across her flawless, unreadable face. The silence stretched so tight, it felt like a physical wire wrapping around Micah's throat. He was just a guy who fixed pressure valves. He did not sign up to be the center of a galactic prophecy. Leora did not flinch under her mother's terrifying gaze. Instead, she shifted her stance, placing herself slightly between the towering queen and the human mechanic. She slid her hand down Micah's arm and confidently interlocked her slender, glowing fingers with his rough, calloused hand. She gripped him tight, a physical anchor in a room that was rapidly spiraling into political madness. She looked up at the towering monarch, then swept her gaze across the trembling, kneeling masses of the Velith Dominion's elite. When she spoke, her voice carried the absolute, undeniable weight of a collapsing star. "This one heard the singing of the palace," Leora declared, her words striking the court like physical blows. "When we were all deaf, 4 months before the grand collision of royal protocol and human grease, Micah Rourke was elbows deep in the metallic guts of the Ashen Halo. The orbital junk station was a floating graveyard of shattered hulls and burnt-out thrusters, anchored precariously on the edge of the galactic exclusion zone. Micah made his living in this miserable patch of space as a graveyard shift resonance tuner, patching up vessels that sane mechanics declared completely dead. He did not care about interstellar politics or ancient empires. He cared about sealing plasma leaks and getting paid his meager 120 credits a shift. A Class 5 plasma dust storm was tearing through the sector that night, howling against the station's outer shielding like a chorus of angry ghosts. Micah was just finishing up a structural weld on a derelict freighter when his proximity sensors screamed, out in the churning, violent purple clouds of the exclusion zone. Something was adrift. It was not a standard cargo hauler. It was a Velith organic skiff, a sleek, teardrop-shaped vessel grown from bioreactive alloys, and it was actively dying. The ship was not just failing, it was convulsing. Great ripples of panicked bioluminescence flashed across its hull, mimicking the violent muscle spasms of a poisoned animal. Micah did not think twice. He grabbed his heavy utility suit, fired up his battered salvage tug, and intercepted the drifting vessel before the storm could shred it into subatomic dust. Forcing the airlock open was like prying apart the jaws of a terrified beast. The interior was a chaotic mess of ruptured luminescent veins and hissing atmospheric vents. The air smelled of burnt ozone, scorched copper, and pure panic. Slumped over the organic command console was the pilot. She wore unmarked civilian flight leather, heavily scorched on the left shoulder, completely devoid of any royal insignias or aristocratic heraldry. Micah had no idea he was looking at the sole heir to a billion-year-old dynasty. To him, she was just another reckless spacer who had flown blindly into a crossfire. Her breathing was shallow, and when her head lolled back, her eyes fluttered open. They were a striking, luminescent silver, wide with the lingering trauma of being actively hunted. Somebody had shot her ship to pieces with high-yield energy weapons, aiming to kill, not to disable. "Hold on, I have got you," Micah said, stepping over a puddle of glowing coolant and reaching for the primary control interface. He plugged his diagnostic pad into the ship's neural port, expecting a standard readout of the damage. Instead, his screen flashed angry red and immediately shorted out. The ship was actively rejecting standard technical commands. The organic vessel was caught in a lethal feedback loop of sheer terror, its internal defense mechanisms turning against its own life support systems. The hull groaned, a high-pitched, agonizing frequency that rattled the fillings in Micah's teeth. The core temperature was spiking fast, The ship was preparing to auto-destruct to end its own suffering. "No, you absolutely do not," Micah muttered. He dropped the useless, smoking datapad onto the deck. Logic, code, and standard algorithms were not going to work here. The ship was a living thing, and it was having a massive panic attack, acting purely on rough, unrefined human instinct. Micah pulled a heavy density wrench from his tool belt. He knelt on the spongy, vibrating deck and began tapping the heavy steel tool against a solid structural rib near the console. Clack, clack, clack. It was a steady, rhythmic, grounding beat, hovering right around 60 beats per minute. It was a steady, calm, human resting heart rate. "Easy now," Micah started talking. Not to the half-conscious girl bleeding on the floor, but to the ship itself. His voice dropped into a low, rumbling baritone, casual, and entirely devoid of fear. "I know it hurts. Look at this mess. Some absolute idiot put a primary nerve cluster right next to a thermal exhaust port. Who designs this stuff? It is pretty, sure, but functionally, it is a total nightmare. Just breathe with me. Follow the rhythm." The girl on the floor shifted, her silver eyes tracking his movements through a haze of pain. She watched, mesmerized, as this grime-covered alien ignored every established protocol of Velith engineering. He was not trying to conquer the ship's systems or force them into compliance with dominant code. He was coaxing it. He was swearing at the elegant architecture, calling it beautiful but stupid. And somehow, the sheer, grounded humanity of his vocal cadence began to soothe the vessel's frantic memory core. The high-pitched screeching of the hull slowly dropped in pitch, sinking down to match the steady clack of his metal wrench. But the core was still bleeding out. Micah shoved his wrench into his pocket and dove headfirst into the ruptured biochamber beneath the main console. He was instantly submerged in a blinding, tearing sea of broken optical fibers and pulsing, ruptured plasma veins. The heat was unbearable, pushing past 50 degrees Celsius. He needed to stabilize the primary resonance loop immediately. He grabbed 2 thick auxiliary cables from his toolkit. He did not have the highly classified Velith biogel required to patch the connection, so he improvised. He hauled over a heavy, industrial air compressor from his salvage suit, cranked the output to a deep, vibrating bass frequency, and jammed the machine directly against the ruptured neural conduit. He tied the auxiliary cables firmly around the breach, using the heavy, rhythmic mechanical vibration of the compressor to manually force the bioveins to realign and fuse back together. It was a brutal, ugly, and entirely unauthorized fix. It was acoustic duct tape, but as the heavy bass rumbled through the floorboards, the ship let out one final, exhausted shudder and stabilized. The angry red emergency lights faded into a soft, steady, recovering blue. The auto-destruct sequence powered down. Micah dragged himself backward out of the chamber, wiping a mixture of sweat and bioluminescent fluid from his forehead with the back of his greasy glove. He found the pilot, sitting up, leaning heavily against the bulkhead. She was staring at him with an expression he could not quite read. It was a complex mixture of profound shock, confusion, and a strange, quiet reverence. Micah just let out a heavy sigh, assuming she was a rich, troublesome noble who took a joyride in a bad sector and got exactly what she paid for. "Ship is stable," Micah grunted, tossing his cables back into his heavy canvas bag. "Your life support is back online, and I bypassed the ruptured thrusters. You have enough juice to limp to a safe port." He walked over and crouched beside her, offering a hand to help her up. "You need to get out of this sector immediately. Whoever chewed you up out there might circle back to finish the job." The girl did not immediately move toward the pilot seat. She reached out, her glowing fingers lightly brushing the rough sleeve of his heavy jacket. She did not recoil from the dirt or the oil. "What is your name?" she asked. Her voice was weak, but she asked the question with an intense gravity, as if she were trying to carve the syllables directly into her own memory. Micah chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that echoed warmly in the small cabin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered, multi-head hydrospanner. He pressed the cold metal tool into her open palm, gently closing her delicate fingers around it. "Micah," he said simply, offering a tired smile. "And do me a favor, lady. Next time, do not let your ship sing like it is dying. It is really bad for my blood pressure." He helped her into the pilot's chair, making sure her hands were steady on the controls. He retreated to his salvage tug, detaching the heavy airlock seals, and watched her sleek vessel engage its silent drives. The ship slipped away, disappearing seamlessly into the swirling, violent remnants of the plasma storm. Micah thought that was the absolute end of it. It was just another weird, exhausting shift on the edge of nowhere. But when Micah finally returned to the ashen halo and ran his routine diagnostic sweep of the perimeter, a cold chill ran down his spine. The station's passive acoustic sensors had flagged a massive anomaly. During the exact 20 minutes, he had been inside her ship, tapping his wrench and calming its frantic heart with his voice. The station had recorded an unprecedented audio pattern echoing from the deep void. It was not random stellar static. It was a colossal, incredibly complex harmonic signature. It had mirrored his voice, shifting and vibrating in the dark space around the station. It was as if something ancient, vast, and entirely unseen had been intently listening to his every word, silently watching the entire rescue from the shadows. The crushing weight of Queen Nasara's gaze pinned Micah to the floorboards. The blinding silver-blue radiance from above had settled into a low, predatory thrum. But the political temperature in the room had skyrocketed. Every aristocratic eye was locked onto him, viewing the grease-stained mechanic not as a diplomatic guest, but as a catastrophic system error made flesh. "You will speak, human," Nisara commanded. Her voice did not echo. It simply dominated the acoustic space of the hall. "You will detail the exact sequence of events regarding your alleged encounter with my daughter. Omit nothing." Micah rubbed the back of his neck, acutely aware that a single wrong syllable might result in his immediate execution. He looked around the circle of towering, hostile aliens. He decided the truth, delivered as bluntly as possible, was his only remaining armor. "Look, Your Majesty," Micah began, dropping his hands to his sides. "I was on shift out by the perimeter. I dragged her ship out of a nasty weather system. That is it. I did not know she was royalty. As far as I could tell, she was just a pilot having a really bad day in a ship that was actively trying to rip its own brains out." A collective hiss of outrage rippled through the gathered royal engineers standing near the dais. To speak of a Velith biovessel in such crude, industrial terms was akin to blasphemy. The vessel was undergoing a trauma-induced cascade failure. One of the lead engineers snapped, stepping forward in his immaculate robes. "Its neural pathways are designed to self-terminate to prevent enemy capture. It is a flawless defense mechanism. You claim you interacted with it. I claim I stopped it from blowing up," Micah shot back, his mechanic's pride momentarily overriding his sense of self-preservation. "Your flawless defense mechanism was basically a symphony, having a massive panic attack. It was bleeding out coolant and screaming at 50,000 hertz. I just gave it a different rhythm to focus on," the engineer sneered, his metallic skin flushing with indigo indignation. "That is a technical impossibility. When a royal matrix enters a Phase 3 rejection cycle, even our most exalted harmonizers cannot reverse the neural collapse. It is considered mathematically unsalvageable. How did a primitive ape bypass 1 billion years of genetic coding?" Micah shrugged, a deeply casual gesture that made several nobles clutch their ceremonial sashes. "Nobody told me it was impossible. So I just did it." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and deeply uncomfortable. The answer was so incredibly naive, yet undeniably factual, that it completely short-circuited the collective Velith intellect. It laid bare the fundamental flaw of their entire hyper-advanced civilization. They were so paralyzed by their own perfection, so strictly bound to their immaculate protocols, that they had lost the ability to improvise. If a manual stated a ship was dead, a Velith let it die. A human just grabbed a wrench and hit it until it worked again. "Preposterous!" boomed a high priest, stepping out from the shadows of the pillars. He pointed a long, glowing staff directly at Micah's chest. "We are entertaining the delusions of a scavenger. The princess claims this creature can hear the song of the palace heart. That is a biological fallacy. The sacred frequency is tuned strictly to the royal bloodline. No off-worlder, let alone a dirt-born primate, possesses the sensory architecture to perceive the divine resonance." Feeling the aggressive heat radiating from the priest's staff, Micah instinctively took a single step backward to give himself some breathing room. The moment his boot heel struck the crystal floor, the massive ring suspended high above violently vibrated, emitting a low, resonant chime that matched the exact tempo of his retreat. The priest froze, his mouth hanging open. The entire court stared at the ceiling, then back at the mechanic's battered boots. Leore seized the moment, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "He is not deaf to it. High Priest, I felt it myself. When he boarded my vessel, the ship did not just stop wailing. It recognized him. It halted its self-destruction the second it registered the acoustic signature of his heartbeat and the cadence of his voice. He acted as a master key, a lock we did not even know our empire possessed." The atmosphere in the Great Hall violently shifted. The situation was no longer a bizarre diplomatic faux pas or a scandalous court farce. If the princess was telling the truth, this profoundly average human had just casually bypassed the most sacred, foundational security layer of the Velith throne. He was talking access to the divine core of their empire. He was a colossal political threat. From the ranks of the military elite, Grand Marshal Sorvain stepped forward. He moved with the smooth, calculated grace of an apex predator. His armor was dark, sleek, and absorbed the ambient light rather than reflecting it. "A master key," Sorvain repeated, tasting the words with obvious distaste. He did not look at the princess. His predatory gaze was fixed entirely on Micah. "Or perhaps a highly sophisticated biological skeleton key. We are assuming this is an accident of nature. Let us consider the alternative. The Earth factions are primitive. Yes, but they are devious. What if this mechanic is not a savior, but a weapon? A genetically tailored spy planted within our borders, designed to infect our sacred infrastructure and compromise the throne from the inside out." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the militaristic factions of the court. Sorvain had smoothly weaponized the miracle, turning Micah from a curious anomaly into a sovereign danger. "He is no spy," Leore protested, stepping forward again. But Nisara raised a single, commanding hand, silencing her daughter instantly. The queen looked down at Micah, her expression completely devoid of mercy or warmth. She was calculating the variables, weighing the survival of her empire against the strange phenomenon standing on her floorboards. "The truth of his nature will not be decided by court debate," Nisara declared, her voice final and absolute. "He will be tested. Marshal Sorvain, you will not touch him. Take the human to the royal life assay sector. Submerge him in the deep resonance chambers. Strip his biology down to its fundamental atoms. If he is a weapon, we will dismantle him. If he is something else, the architecture will reveal it." Two heavily armed royal guards immediately stepped out of the shadows, their plasma pikes humming as they flanked Micah on both sides. The order was a polite euphemism for extreme, invasive biological interrogation. A lesser being would have fallen to their knees, begged for diplomatic immunity, or panicked. Micah looked at the terrifying guards, then at the Grand Marshal, and finally up at the towering, ruthless queen. He let out a long, deeply exhausted sigh, letting his shoulders slump. "Look, if you are going to lock me in a medical scanner and treat me like a high-risk lab rat," Micah said, rubbing his temple where a headache was aggressively forming. "Could somebody please just get me a glass of water first? It has been a really long shift." The central residence chamber was buried deep beneath the diplomatic wings, isolated from the overwhelming grandeur of the upper levels. Down here, the aesthetic stripped away all political theater, leaving only the raw, exposed nerves of the palace architecture. It was a perfectly spherical room, composed of dark, porous, acoustic baffling. The chamber was engineered to absorb absolutely every stray sound wave, creating an anechoic void so profound that a normal person could hear the blood rushing through their own cranial veins. There was only one sound permitted to exist in this space, a microscopic, infrasonic vibration bleeding up through the floor, grates directly from the living core of the planet. Micah sat perfectly still on a diagnostic slab, feeling intensely out of place. He had been stripped of his heavy utility jacket, leaving him in a simple gray undershirt. A web of translucent, bioluminescent sensor patches clung to his temples, his throat, and his wrists. Surrounding him was a cadre of Velith scholars, their faces drawn tight with academic frustration. For the past 2 hours, they had subjected him to every biological, spectral, and neural scan in their extensive imperial database. They had searched for microscopic cybernetics, dormant genetic triggers, and latent bioweapon signatures. They found absolutely zero anomalies. The lead scholar, a slender Velith with deep violet skin, tapped furiously on a floating holographic display. He looked deeply offended by the data. "His cellular structure is completely mundane," the scholar reported, his voice tight. "He is comprised primarily of water and carbon. His internal temperature is exactly 98.6 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. He exhibits minor signs of sleep deprivation and mild musculoskeletal strain in the lumbar region. There is no hidden matrix. There is no engineered mutation. He is, by every conceivable metric, an entirely ordinary, low-functioning primate." "Then explain the environmental readouts," a voice commanded from the shadows near the doorway. Queen Nisara stood there, her presence chilling the already cold room. She had not left since the testing began, watching the human with the terrifying patience of a hunting falcon. The lead scholar swallowed hard, gesturing to a massive secondary screen hovering above the slab. "That is the anomaly, Your Majesty. His biology is static, but the room itself is reacting to his presence. The baseline resonance of the chamber is no longer running on its standard billion-year cycle." The scholar dragged a glowing finger across the display, overlaying Micah's vital signs with the room's ambient frequency. They matched perfectly. Every time Micah inhaled, the ambient light in the room flared a fraction of a percent brighter. Every time his heart beat, the microscopic vibration beneath the floorboards surged in absolute synchronization. "The palace architecture is mirroring his autonomic nervous system," the scholar whispered, sounding terrified. "It is behaving as if his physical rhythm is the dominant command code." Micah rubbed his face, peeling one of the sensor patches off his forehead with a sharp wince. The oppressive silence of the room was giving him a headache. But it was not the lack of sound that was bothering him. It was the noise hiding underneath it. "Look, I do not know anything about command codes," Micah said, his voice sounding flat and muffled in the sound-absorbing room. "But if you guys are the experts, maybe you can tell me how to turn off the audio feed." "It is driving me crazy." The scholars froze. The lead researcher turned slowly, staring at Micah as if the human had just sprouted a second head. "Audio feed. There is no audio feed in this chamber. This room is acoustically sealed to absolute zero. You cannot possibly be hearing anything." "Well, I am," Micah insisted, pressing the heels of his hands against his ears. I have been hearing it since the moment those guards dragged me into the main hall upstairs. It got louder on the elevator ride down. And in here, it is practically vibrating in my teeth. Queen Nisara stepped out of the shadows, her dark eyes narrowing. Describe exactly what you hear. Human. Micah struggled to find the right words. It was not a mechanical sound, nor was it a simple alarm. It is a melody, he explained, gesturing vaguely at the floor. But it is completely messed up. It sounds like a choir trying to hit a harmony, but somebody has their hands wrapped around the singers' throats. It is a choked, desperate, broken loop, like someone trying to scream through a mouthful of sand. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the chamber. The lead scholar dropped his holographic datapad. It hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The younger researchers stared at Micah with naked horror. "The heart choir," one of the junior scholars breathed, crossing his arms over his chest in an ancient warding gesture. Micah looked around, confused. "The what?" "It is our foundational myth," Leoray's voice rang out. The princess emerged from the corridor behind her mother, blatantly ignoring the strict quarantine protocols. She stepped into the sterile room, her silver eyes fixed on Micah. "The heart choir is the sentient collective embedded in the planet's core. Legend says it is the entity that first sang our ancestors into sentience and chose the very first queens of Velith. But no living being has actually heard its voice in over 10,000 years. Leoray turned to the scholars, her jaw set with a sudden, furious defiance. "Or so you all claimed," the queen stiffened. "Leoray, you overstep." "No, mother. I am tired of the silence," the princess countered, stepping closer to the diagnostic slab. She looked directly at the lead scholar. "Tell him the truth. Tell him what you told me when I was 7 years old, and again when I was 12, and again last year." The scholar averted his eyes, looking physically sick. "Princess, the royal physicians diagnosed you with genetic resonance fatigue, a phantom acoustic phenomenon caused by the sheer pressure of your bloodline." "They called me defective," Leoray translated, turning back to Micah. "Since I was a child, I have heard the exact same choked melody you are describing, but the song kept getting weaker, more fragmented. When I tried to warn the high priests, they told me I was suffering from delusions caused by royal blood overload. They forced me into acoustic therapy to suppress it. They told me the palace heart was perfect, and therefore my mind had to be the thing that was broken." Micah looked from the angry princess to the terrified scholars. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his practical, mechanic's brain. This was not a mystical religious experience. This was a catastrophic engineering failure hidden beneath centuries of dogma. "It is not a holy song," Micah said bluntly. "And you are not crazy, princess. It is an SOS. He swung his legs off the slab, ignoring the frantic protests of the researchers. "Any system, whether it is made of steel or organic crystal, creates a baseline harmonic when it runs. When the bearings lose lubrication, or a plasma vent clogs, the frequency changes. It grinds. It chokes. Whatever this heart choir thing is down there, it is not singing to you. It is suffocating. It has been forced to run out of alignment for so long that it is basically begging for someone to hit the emergency stop button." As if triggered by his words, the ambient lighting in the anechoic chamber violently shifted from a sterile white to a deep, angry crimson. The smooth, dark walls of the room suddenly rippled, contracting like the muscles of a stomach rejecting poison. A piercing, high-frequency alarm shattered the silence. The diagnostic monitors surrounding the slab exploded in a flurry of red error codes. "Resonance cascade!" the lead scholar screamed, stumbling backward as the floor beneath them began to heave. "The local network is rejecting the phase shift. We are going to be crushed." The Velith protocol for a phase rejection was to immediately evacuate and seal the sector. The guards moved to grab the queen and the princess. Micah did not evacuate. His brain bypassed the panic and locked into pure, unadulterated troubleshooting mode. He saw a cluster of exposed bioluminescent cables, pulsing erratically near an auxiliary terminal embedded in the wall. The pulses were entirely out of sync, fighting against each other in a destructive loop. He sprinted across the heaving floor. He did not know how to read Velith syntax, and he did not have his heavy-density wrench. He only had his bare hands. Micah slammed his open palms against the heavy, crystalline surface of the terminal. He did not try to input a code. He listened to the chaotic, screaming rhythm of the failing lights, found the gap in the sequence, and physically pounded a heavy, syncopated counterbeat directly into the console. One strong strike. A pause of half a second. Two rapid strikes. He forced his human, imperfect rhythm into the system, acting as a physical acoustic dampener against the runaway feedback loop. He hit the console a fourth time, driving his full weight into the strike. The crimson lights froze. The walls stopped contracting. A deep, heavy sigh seemed to echo through the floorboards, and the ambient lighting slowly reset to a calm, steady cyan. Micah leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, his knuckles bruised. Behind him, the room was locked in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. The scholars stared at his hands, as if he had just pulled a dying star out of his pocket. In all of Velith history, no unshielded biological entity had ever physically bridged a resonance cascade without being instantly incinerated by the feedback. The human had just corrected a localized system collapse by playing it like a percussion instrument. Queen Nisara slowly walked past her stunned guards. She did not look at the stabilized console, nor did she look at the terrified scholars. She stopped right in front of Micah, her abyssal black eyes studying every line of his tired, sweating face. The terrifying mask of royal indifference had cracked, revealing something far more dangerous beneath. "If you can truly hear it," Nisara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence, "then my daughter is not the only one in danger." The apex chamber was the antithesis of the grand public halls. There were no sweeping vistas or soothing bioluminescence here. It was a brutalist amphitheater, forged from jagged obsidian and stark, unforgiving white light, designed explicitly for the dissection of imperial crises. Micah stood in the center of the sunken floor, trapped inside a projected ring of hard light confinement. He felt less like a guest and more like a biological weapon awaiting decommission. Above him, seated in tiered, imposing balconies, were the highest-ranking architects of the Velith Dominion. They did not look at him with wonder. They looked at him with cold, calculated arithmetic. "The human must be isolated immediately," Grand Marshal Sorvain declared, his voice echoing sharply against the obsidian walls. He paced the edge of the military balcony, his dark armor absorbing the harsh light. "He must be quarantined in a maximal suppression vault and barred from all contact with the royal line. He has infected the succession bloodline with dissonance. We are witnessing the systematic degradation of Her Highness." From the opposite side of the amphitheater, a block of aristocrats draped in heavy crimson sashes stood in unified agreement. They were the Vanguard faction, the unapologetic proponents of galactic expansion and total war. "The Grand Marshal speaks the truth," their lead representative sneered, glaring down at Leoray, who stood defiantly on a separate, isolated podium near her mother. "Her Highness has allowed human fragility to taint her judgment. This infection began 4 months ago during her highly illegal, unauthorized excursion to the frontier border. Our fleets are preparing for the grand expansion mandate. Yet our future queen abandons her post to play with scavengers in the mud." Leoray's hands gripped the edges of her podium, so tightly her knuckles glowed white. She did not shrink under the verbal assault. Instead, she leaned forward, her silver eyes blazing with a fury that made several nobles instinctively recoil. "I did not flee for amusement," Leoray shot back, her voice ringing with multi-layered harmonic authority. I left because I was the only one paying attention to the silence. I went to the frontier because 6 entire border outposts vanished from the official star charts. They were not conquered. They did not report a catastrophic failure. They were simply erased from the imperial memory banks, taking thousands of inhabitants with them. The chamber erupted into overlapping shouts of denial and outrage. The Vanguard nobles demanded she be silenced for spreading sedition. Inside his hard light cage, Micah listened intently, his mechanic's brain automatically sorting the chaotic data points into a logical schematic. He remembered the specific, ugly details of the crippled organic ship he had hauled out of the plasma storm. He remembered what had been broken and, more importantly, what had been perfectly intact. That was not a random pirate attack, Micah said loudly. His rough, unrefined voice cut through the elegant, high-frequency arguments of the Velith elite like a rusted saw blade. The chamber fell into a shocked, deeply offended silence. A prisoner was not allowed to speak during a high council session. Micah ignored the hostile glares and looked directly at Liore. When I pulled your vessel out of the storm, I had to bypass the life support. I saw the damage profile. Whoever shot you up specifically targeted your emergency ejection pods and severed the automated distress beacon right at the neural root. But they intentionally avoided hitting the primary reactor shielding. They did not want to vaporize you. They wanted to leave a perfectly pristine, floating coffin. They wanted a plausible accident. Sorvain stopped pacing. His predatory eyes locked onto the human with a terrifying, 0-degree intensity. Liore turned toward the highest throne, seeking validation. Queen Nisara sat upon it, a towering monument of ice and absolute stillness. She had not spoken a single word since the trial began. "Mother, you know this is true," Liore pleaded, her voice cracking slightly, betraying a sudden, profound vulnerability. "You saw the telemetry data I brought back. You know someone inside this very palace is orchestrating the erasure of our people to force the war mandate." Nisara looked down at her daughter. Her expression was completely unreadable. She did not confirm the accusation. She did not deny it. She simply remained a silent, unmoving sovereign, prioritizing the terrifying stability of the empire over the desperate plea of her own child. The silence was a devastating blow. Liore stepped back from her podium, her posture faltering. She looked suddenly incredibly small, realizing that her mother was perfectly willing to let her stand alone in the crossfire if it preserved the illusion of the throne's absolute control. Seizing the momentum, a towering high priest of the resonance stepped forward, his robes sweeping across the dark floor. The princess is suffering from severe phase delusion, brought on by the chaotic influence of this creature, the priest intoned, pointing a long, glowing finger at Micah. The solution is clear. We must perform the rite of acoustic severing. We will physically and neurologically strip the human's biometric signature from the Palace Hearts Registry. Only then can order be restored. A junior scholar from the Vanguard faction leaned over the railing, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The shockwave of a forced severing will undoubtedly liquefy the primate's central nervous system. A regrettable, but entirely necessary purge. Standing in the center of the hostile amphitheater, Micah finally understood the brutal reality of his situation. He had been a fool to think he was just an accidental bystander. He replayed the chaotic moment in the Great Hall, the desperate, crushing embrace from the princess. That hug had not been a simple gesture of gratitude. It had been a tactical nuclear strike. By physically touching him in front of the entire court, Liore had forcefully lashed her political survival to his existence. She had branded him as the physical manifestation of the system's hidden truth. She had dragged a lowly, expendable human mechanic into the center of a galactic board game, using him as a living shield because she knew her enemies could not quietly assassinate a man who was actively tethered to the divine core of the Empire. Just as the high priest raised his hands to formally call for the execution disguised as a ritual, the apex chamber violently shuddered. It was not a physical earthquake. It was a massive, systemic data hemorrhage. The colossal holographic table in the center of the room, designed to project flawless imperial cartography, suddenly shrieked with a burst of deafening static. The elegant blue projection shattered, replaced by a violently flashing crimson error code. The Royal Archive system was attempting to auto-correct a massive logic paradox and failing spectacularly. A flood of heavily encrypted, deeply buried text began to vomit across the screens, completely overriding the Council's manual controls. Colony designation Alpha 7, population 40,000, status purged by High Command. The automated voice of the archive system echoed flatly through the room. Colony designation Kalen Prime, population 120,000, status purged by High Command. The secret was bleeding out onto the floor. Someone with supreme access had actively rewritten history from inside the palace core. But the biological architecture of the system was finally rejecting the lie. Pandemonium erupted. The Vanguard nobles shouted for the system to be forcibly shut down. Sorvain drew his ceremonial plasma blade, his face twisted in a mask of cold fury, screaming at the royal guards to secure the archives. A single, deafening strike of a scepter against the obsidian floor instantly paralyzed the room. Queen Nisara finally stood. The ambient light in the chamber seemed to dim around her. When she spoke, the authority in her voice was absolute, crushing the chaos into immediate submission. "The human will not be severed today," Nisara declared, her dark eyes sweeping over the terrified council before settling on Sorvain. "The grand coronation is scheduled in exactly 3 days. Princess Leore's ascension to the throne cannot, and will not, proceed under the shadow of a corrupted archive and a fractured dominion." The queen turned her piercing gaze down to Micah, who was still locked inside the hard light cage. "A flawless system cannot diagnose its own disease," Nisara said coldly. "Only a dissonant key can bypass a corrupted lock. The trial is suspended. You, human, will accompany the princess down into the choir vault. You will bypass the security quarantine. You will interface with the core, and you will extract the unedited truth of what happened to my borders." She leaned forward, delivering the final, crushing ultimatum. "If you fail, the Empire burns in a civil war, and I will personally ensure that your execution takes significantly longer than a single shockwave." The descent took nearly 3 hours, moving far beyond the polished, radiant majesty of the upper courts. The sleek, metallic elevators gave way to a crude, descending spiral pathway carved from raw, ancient bedrock. The sterile, flawless illumination of the diplomatic wings was completely gone. In its place, thick, translucent veins ran along the jagged cavern walls, pulsing with a sickly, bruised purple light. They did not look like wiring or structural supports. They looked exactly like a massive, exposed nervous system. Micah walked beside Princess Leore, followed closely by a detail of 4 elite royal pathfinders. The air grew incredibly dense, smelling heavily of ozone, scorched copper, and damp earth. Every step they took downward amplified the desperate, choked rhythm vibrating in Micah's chest. They finally reached the floor of the choir vault. Micah stepped off the stone pathway onto a spongy, organic platform and looked out over a vast subterranean cavern. He had expected to find a colossal machine, a glowing crystalline computer core, or some hyper-advanced architectural marvel. Instead, suspended over a bottomless abyss, was a colossal, gelatinous mass of interconnected biological tendrils and glowing synaptic clusters. It was a living, sprawling entity the size of a mountain, and it was entirely chained. Massive, crude obsidian pylons pierced its central mass, driving deep into its glowing flesh, siphoning its raw life force up into the palace above. It writhed weakly, trapped in an eternal, inescapable cycle of being drained and regenerated. The choked melody Micah had been hearing was deafening down here. It was no longer a subtle vibration. It was a physical weight pressing against his eardrums, a relentless wail of absolute agony. Leorai fell to her knees. The majestic, divine calling she had revered since childhood, the holy song she believed marked her as the true heir, was a lie. She was not listening to a god bestowing grace. She was listening to a prisoner being tortured on a rack. "They bound it," Leorai whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the massive obsidian spikes. "Our ancestors did not forge a pact with the planet. They enslaved it. They turned a living collective into an engine to power our ships and our thrones." Around the perimeter of the cavern, thousands of calcified nodules grew from the rock walls, glowing with trapped, flickering light. They were organic data drives, memory notes secreted away by the entity itself, archiving the truths the Empire had tried to delete. Micah approached the nearest cluster. He reached out and pressed his bare hand against a glowing node. A violent, chaotic flash of images tore directly through his mind. He did not just see the data. He felt it. He saw a vibrant frontier world bathed in golden light. He saw Velith colonists refusing a direct order from the military tribunal to equip their massive atmospheric processors with orbital strike capabilities. Then, he felt the sickening, tearing sensation of a forced amputation. He saw the obsidian pylons in the deep vault driving downward, violently severing that specific colony from the Imperial Resonance Network. Micah ripped his hand away, gasping for breath, stumbling backward until he hit the rock wall. "They were not natural disasters," Micah rasped, wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He looked at Leorai, his chest heaving. "Those 6 border outposts you were looking for. They did not get wiped out by solar flares or pirate raids. Marshal Sorvain and his faction cut them off. They starved them of the resonance that keeps their bioinfrastructure alive. Those people suffocated because they refused to become a military asset." He forced himself to stand straight, piecing the horrifying mechanical logic together. "Sorvain is not just hiding a purge. He is using the upcoming coronation as a trap. When you take the throne, the ceremony requires a full synchronization with the core. Sorvain intends to hijack that interface. He wants to force this chained entity into a single, absolute frequency, overriding the free will of every citizen, every ship, every colony. He is going to turn your entire dominion into a flawlessly synchronized, unfeeling engine of war." Leorai touched her chest, her silver eyes widening in pure horror as the realization dawned on her. The attack out in the plasma storm 4 months ago made perfect, terrifying sense now. "That is why they targeted my ship," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "I am the only heir left who can still hear the dissonance. If I take the throne, I might instinctively resist the forced synchronization. I would feel the pain of the transition. Sorvain had to remove me to ensure the new frequency faced no biological resistance. He needs a perfect, silent coronation." She turned to Micah, her expression twisting with a mixture of despair and profound confusion. "But why are the others deaf? Why does my mother? Why do the high priests hear nothing but silence when this creature is screaming so loudly it shakes the bedrock?" Micah shook his head, looking up at the tragic, beautiful architecture of the cavern. "Because your people are obsessed with perfection. From the moment you are born, your brains are culturally and biologically conditioned to filter out anomalies. You are taught to ignore deviations from the mathematical ideal. Your empire trained its citizens to treat pain and chaos as error codes and automatically delete them from perception." He gestured to himself, a rough, grease-stained human standing in the ruins of an alien god. "Humans do not work like that. We are born in chaos. We live in the mud. We make mistakes, and we thrive on variables. We do not have a flawless melody to protect." I heard the distress signal specifically because my mind is not programmed to demand perfection. I am used to broken things. I recognize the truth hiding inside the ugly, distorted noise. As they moved cautiously along the outer ridge of the abyss, aiming to extract more uncorrupted data from the memory nodes, Leore suddenly stopped. She knelt beside the base of a massive central pylon and brushed aside a thick layer of luminescent moss. Hidden beneath the overgrowth was a discarded object. It was a ceremonial crest, forged from pale gold, bearing the highly restricted personal sigil of the ruling monarch. Micah looked at the dusty crest, then at the sprawling, tortured entity above them. The ultimate, crushing betrayal clicked into place. She knew, Leore choked out, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her metallic cheeks. She clutched the golden crest to her chest. My mother knew. Queen Nisara had not been ignorant. Decades ago, she had made this exact same journey down the spiral path. She had stood on this very ledge, looked up at the enslaved foundation of her empire, and felt its profound agony. But she had looked at the terrifying mathematics of salvation. Breaking the obsidian chains would instantly collapse the Imperial Resonance Network. Billions of citizens across hundreds of star systems, completely dependent on the bioinfrastructure for atmosphere, food, and transit, would perish in the chaotic reboot. The Queen had made a terrifying, cold calculation. She chose to perpetuate the torture of an ancient collective to prevent the immediate, catastrophic extinction of her people. She had borne the crushing silence as a personal penance, playing the role of an unfeeling tyrant to buy her empire time she did not know how to use. The heavy, sorrowful revelation was violently shattered by the searing, deafening hiss of a high-yield plasma charge. One of their royal pathfinders collapsed forward. A smoking, perfectly round hole burned clean through his heavy armor. His body tumbled over the ledge, disappearing into the dark abyss below. From the deep shadows of the upper stalactites, dozens of heavily armored figures began descending rapidly on anti-gravity tethers. Their armor was dark, completely devoid of the royal silver, bearing the jagged crimson insignia of the Vanguard faction. Sorvain's loyalists had not waited for the coronation. The Grand Marshal had already infected the deepest, most sacred sanctuary of the Dominion, as plasma fire erupted across the organic platform, shattering the ancient memory nodes into clouds of glowing dust. It became brutally clear that Sorvain had sent his elite hunters down into the dark to ensure the princess and her human key never saw the light of the upper levels again. Plasma fire rained from the cavern ceiling, shattering the fragile silence of the deep vault. Micah grabbed Leore by the shoulder, physically hauling her behind a massive, calcified pillar, just as a searing barrage of energy melted the floor where they had been standing seconds prior. The surviving royal guards returned fire, their plasma pikes illuminating the dark in frantic bursts. But they were hopelessly outgunned. The Vanguard assassins descended on anti-gravity tethers with terrifying, synchronized precision, moving as a single, flawless unit. Micah pressed his back against the stone, his mind racing. He knew they could not win a firefight against elite soldiers bred for absolute combat perfection. He looked at the glowing, fleshy walls of the vault and remembered a fundamental truth about Velith engineering. Their entire society, right down to their military targeting arrays and biological friend or foe recognition systems, relied on flawless harmonic synchronization. They required perfect order to function. Micah picked up a heavy, jagged shard of shattered obsidian from the debris. He did not aim at the descending soldiers. Instead, he turned to a massive cluster of exposed, raw synaptic nerves pulsing on the cavern wall. He threw his entire body weight into striking the biological conduit. He hammered out a brutal, violently irregular, deeply syncopated rhythm. It was a chaotic, heavy percussion solo played directly onto the planet's exposed nervous system. The living walls shrieked in response. A massive, invisible wave of acoustic feedback slammed through the chamber. The Vanguard assassins suddenly faltered midair. Their sleek, dark helmets sparked violently. The chaotic human rhythm completely scrambled their harmonic targeting subroutines. To their advanced visors, the baseline frequency was corrupted. Every perfectly synced ally suddenly registered as a hostile, dissonant threat. Their automated weapons instantly locked onto each other. In the ensuing confusion, friendly fire erupted among the attackers, breaking their flawless formation into panicked chaos. Leore stared at the sheer pandemonium unfolding above them. Her entire life, the Imperial scholars had preached that human messiness was a primitive, pathetic disease. Now, she saw it for what it truly was. It was an unpredictable, devastating weapon against a civilization that had completely forgotten how to adapt to a sudden variable. "Move now!" Micah yelled over the noise. They sprinted away from the crossfire, diving into a narrow secondary artery of the vault. This tunnel was not carved from stone. It was entirely organic. The fleshy walls expanded and contracted with wet, heavy breaths, forcing them to time their sprints through sections that squeezed shut like a giant, muscular esophagus. As they paused in a wider chamber to catch their breath, Micah held out his hand. "The tool," he demanded, his voice echoing over the wet sounds of the breathing tunnel. "The hydrospanner I gave you on the salvage station. Hand it over." Leore reached under her heavy silken sash and pulled out the battered piece of human engineering. Micah took the memory node they had ripped from the archive cluster earlier. He stripped the delicate alien optical wires with his teeth, aggressively splicing the highly advanced bioorganic crystal directly into the crude, durable data port of his multi-tool. It was a terrible, ugly patch job, violating every rule of digital architecture. But the tiny screen on the spanner blinked green. The purged colony data was safely locked inside a device the Imperial scanners would never recognize as a digital threat. A heavy plasma bolt suddenly scorched the wall right next to Micah's head, showering them in glowing sparks. He spun around. The shot had not come from the pursuing Vanguard behind them. It came from the front. One of their own royal pathfinders stood blocking the path, his weapon raised and aimed directly at the princess. "I am sorry, Your Highness," the guard stated, his voice devoid of any inflection or regret. "But the Grand Marshal is right. Your empathy is a sickness that will doom us all. Under the new frequency, the Dominion will be cured. We will be forged into an instrument of absolute clarity, free from the pathetic weakness of emotional hesitation." Before the traitor could pull the trigger a second time, the organic tunnel violently spasmed. A massive, muscular ridge in the floor suddenly buckled upward, crushing the guard's leg beneath a ton of shifting biomatter. He screamed, dropping his weapon as he collapsed. The sounds of the Vanguard pursuit echoed closely down the corridor. They had less than a minute before the assassins caught up. "Leave him," Micah urged, assessing the brutal tactical reality. "He just tried to execute you. We need to keep moving." Leore looked at the bleeding traitor, then back at the dark, pursuing shadows in the tunnel. She shook her head, rushing forward. She grabbed the guard by his heavy shoulder plating and hoisted him up. She strained against his weight, dragging him forward despite his protests. Micah stared at her, stunned by the sheer, irrational mercy of the act. Then, he moved to her other side, taking the guard's other arm to shoulder the burden. As they dragged the man who had just tried to kill them, Micah realized this was exactly why the ancient core had responded to her in the first place. True strength was not about enforcing perfect order or eliminating the weak. It was about choosing to carry the broken pieces when logic dictated you should throw them away. They finally reached the upper catacombs, panting and exhausted, dragging the wounded guard into a massive antechamber. The heavy metallic doors to the lower palace levels stood before them, offering their only avenue of escape. But the exit was completely sealed. Standing in perfect, impenetrable ranks were 50 members of the Queen's personal guard. At the center of the phalanx stood Queen Nisara herself. Her face was a mask of cold, terrifying marble. She raised her hand, signaling her troops to level their heavy plasma rifles directly at her own daughter. Leoray stopped dead, her heart breaking. The crushing reality settled over her. Her mother had chosen the terrifying stability of the throne over the survival of her child. They were trapped. Micah tightened his grip on his heavy multi-tool, preparing to fight a completely unwinnable battle. But as he looked at the imposing monarch, his eyes caught a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Nisara held her grand crystalline scepter loosely in her right hand. She was tapping the base of it against the polished floor. It was not the steady, majestic pulse of royal authority. It was a highly irregular, jagged beat. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It was the exact same choked, broken rhythm they had heard from the suffering entity chained in the vault below. It was a secret code played out in plain sight, a signal that only someone who had truly listened to the dissonant song could possibly understand. The Queen was intentionally creating a bureaucratic, ceremonial standoff to physically block the Vanguard from advancing up this specific corridor. She was buying them time while pretending to corner them. Micah dropped his makeshift weapon. He placed a hand over Leoray's wrist, gently forcing her to lower her defensive stance. He nodded toward the Queen, deciding in that split second to put his life entirely in the hands of an alien monarch he barely understood. He was no longer just a mechanic fixing a broken pipe. He was a willing participant, stepping into the fire of an interstellar revolution. Less than an hour later, the grand holographic projectors across the entire capital city flared to life. The faces of Princess Leoray and the human mechanic were broadcast to billions of citizens. Marshal Sorvain, standing proudly beside the silent Queen, formally declared the pair as rogue elements, infected by a lethal biological dissonance. Warrants for their immediate capture were authorized. And despite the chaos, the grand coronation was mandated to proceed in exactly 48 hours, an inescapable trap snapping shut over the entire empire. The capital city of the Velith Dominion was ablaze with 1 billion points of celebratory light. From the orbital viewing stations, the planetary surface looked like a flawless, glittering jewel, pulsating with the joyful, synchronized rhythm of the upcoming royal ascension. The grand avenues were flooded with millions of citizens, their voices raised in perfectly harmonized hymns of devotion. Yet, hidden beneath the blinding glare of the festival, the cold, silent machinery of a military coup was sliding into position. Out in the freezing void of high orbit, 300 Vanguard stealth cruisers engaged their light-bending shrouds, forming an inescapable blockade around the capital. Marshal Sorvain had sealed the planet. The grand coronation was no longer a sacred transfer of power. It was a beautifully illuminated trap. Deep within the subterranean detention sectors, Micah Rourke was experiencing the exact opposite of a festival. He was locked inside a total harmonic suppression cell. The room was not simply soundproofed. It was actively hostile to his biology. The walls were lined with null frequency generators, designed to identify the chaotic, irregular rhythms of a human body and forcefully cancel them out. The air felt thick, pressing against his lungs like wet cement. The cell was attempting to erase his physical presence, flattening his heartbeat and his breathing into absolute, compliant silence. Sorvain intended to reduce the human to a mathematical zero, ensuring he could not interfere with the coronation network. But the Grand Marshal had made a profound miscalculation. By artificially silencing Micah's internal human noise, the suppression cell acted as a massive acoustic filter. With his own physical distractions stripped away, Micah was suddenly plunged into the raw, unfiltered consciousness of the chained entity beneath the palace. The dying agony of the heart choir was no longer a distant, choked melody. It was a torrential flood of pure, crystalline suffering pouring directly into Micah's mind. He could feel the cold, jagged bite of the obsidian pylons, He could feel the terrifying, empty spaces where the erased colonies used to be. The entity was exhausted, terrified, and preparing to be permanently lobotomized. Micah dropped to his knees on the cold floor, clutching his head, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the planetary despair. He was just one mechanic, buried in the dark, while an entire civilization prepared to march over a cliff. Far above him, the Great Hall was packed to its absolute capacity. 10,000 aristocrats, high priests, and fleet commanders stood in immaculate, flawless rows. They believed they were attending the most sacred ritual of their generation. None of them realized they were participating in a soft, bloodless conquest. Princess Leoray stood at the base of the Grand Ascension dais. She was draped in the heavy, restrictive ceremonial armor of the succession, woven from spun platinum and liquid starlight. The garments were designed to project divine authority, but right now, they felt like a beautiful, crushing straitjacket. She kept her chin raised, her silver eyes fixed forward, but internally, she was entirely adrift. She looked up at the towering throne. Queen Nisara sat upon it, a terrifying monument of glacial indifference. The monarch gave no sign of rebellion, no hint of a counter-strategy. She watched the proceedings with the cold calculation of an apex predator that had already accepted defeat. Leoray's heart ached with a profound, bitter doubt. She did not know if her mother was silently sacrificing herself to protect the throne, or simply abandoning her daughter to maintain the illusion of order. Marshal Sorvain stepped up to the Grand Lectern, his dark armor a stark contrast to the blinding white and gold of the surrounding nobility. He did not address the princess. He addressed the millions of citizens watching the broadcast across the galaxy. "Citizens of the Dominion," Sorvain's voice boomed, perfectly modulated and projected through the massive acoustic rings hovering above the hall. "We gather today not just for a succession, but for a necessary purification. It is with heavy hearts that the High Council has discovered a lethal biological dissonance within the royal matrix. Her Highness has been polluted by the chaotic, primitive influence of humanity." A collective gasp rippled through the 10,000 nobles. Sorvain raised a hand, commanding absolute silence. "This infection threatens the very fabric of our perfection," the marshal continued, his tone shifting from sorrow to unyielding authority. "Therefore, the traditional ascension cannot proceed. We must initiate an absolute synchronization ritual. We will overwrite the corrupted bloodline and fuse the entire empire into a single, flawless, unbreakable frequency. We will cure the weakness of emotion. We will become absolute." It was a brilliant, horrifying legal maneuver. Sorvain was using the human's presence to justify stripping the princess of her free will, permanently tying the entire Velith population to his military command codes under the guise of medical salvation. Leoray closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable wave of crushing energy that would rip her consciousness away. But exactly 2 seconds before the high priests raised their staves to begin the chant, the massive crystalline rings near the vaulted ceiling violently flickered. It was an infinitesimal glitch. A fraction of a second, where the flawless Imperial broadcast was forcefully interrupted by a burst of raw, jagged static. To the assembled Velith nobility, it sounded like a minor atmospheric interference. But down in the suffocating darkness of the suppression cell, Micah heard it. The null field generators surrounding him momentarily short-circuited, sparking with a sudden surge of unauthorized power. Micah snapped his eyes open. That was not a system error. That was a deliberate, hyper-compressed localized override. Nisara was still sitting like a frozen statue on her throne, but she had just used her supreme administrative access to crack the acoustic firewall of his cell for a handful of seconds. The Queen had given him a window. Micah did not have his heavy-density wrench. He did not have his diagnostic tools or a scrap of salvage wire. He only had his own body and the dense, acoustic architecture of his prison. He threw himself against the reinforced door of the cell. He used the brief lapse in the suppression field to turn the entire room into a massive resonance box. He raised his heavy fists and began to strike the dense metal plating. He did not hit it randomly. He hammered out the exact same, steady, deeply unrefined rhythm he had used 4 months ago inside a dying, crippled organic ship out in the plasma storms. It was a grounded, stubborn, 60 beat per minute tempo. It was the rhythm of a human mechanic refusing to let a machine give up. He struck the door with everything he had, forcing the heavy vibrations into the physical infrastructure of the palace, riding the reverse feedback loop Nisara had briefly left open. Up in the Great Hall, Sorvain raised his hands, signaling the high priests to drop the ceremonial hammers. The absolute synchronization was initiating. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, pressing down on the minds of the nobles, preparing to wipe away their individuality. Then, Liare felt it. It did not come from the air. It came up through the soles of her boots, vibrating through the crystalline floorboards beneath the dais. A slow, heavy, profoundly imperfect beat. Clack, pause, clack. Her breath hitched. The suffocating terror that had gripped her chest suddenly evaporated. The rhythm was ugly. It was completely out of sync with the majestic palace architecture, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. It meant the mechanic had survived the deep vault. It meant the heart choir was not yet entirely subdued. The human was fighting back from the dark, anchored to the core, sending her a lifeline. Liare opened her eyes. The despair was gone, replaced by a searing, absolute resolve. She was no longer a victim, waiting for the executioner. At the podium, Sorvain threw his arms downward. The grand crystal rings ignited with a blinding, terrifying crimson light. The absolute synchronization protocol slammed into the palace grid. A singular, deafening tone erupted through the hall, a frequency so heavy and perfect it forced every noble to their knees. The walls of the Velith Dominion began to lock into a single, unified, unfeeling rhythm. If the cycle completed its first revolution, the empire would be enslaved forever, trapped in a cage of its own flawless design. The countdown to absolute silence had begun. The heavy vault door of the suppression cell did not just unlock. Its structural integrity dissolved for exactly 4 seconds. The suffocating null field abruptly collapsed, allowing a rush of stale, metallic air to flood the chamber. Micah stumbled forward, gasping violently as his lungs expanded. His heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. Standing in the dimly lit, jagged corridor was not a squad of heavily armed Vanguard executioners. It was a flickering, translucent, hard-light projection of Queen Nisara. Her regal, terrifying facade was entirely stripped away, revealing a profoundly exhausted ruler holding onto the frayed edges of her sanity. "I cannot stop the synchronization ceremony from the throne," the projection whispered, her voice layered with heavy digital static and profound desperation. "If I openly defy the Grand Marshal in the Great Hall, the Vanguard cruisers waiting in high orbit will immediately glass the capital city. A civil war will ignite on the floorboards before I can even draw my next breath." Micah leaned heavily against the cold obsidian wall, wiping a layer of cold sweat from his face. He looked at the towering monarch with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "So you are just going to let him lobotomize your daughter and enslave your entire empire? You knew exactly what was happening down in the choir vault for years. You left that living entity chained up in the dark." The monarch's avatar flickered violently, her expression twisting with a deeply buried, ancient agony. "I did not forge those chains, human. I inherited them. For over 2 decades, I have ruled this dominion by merely delaying the inevitable collapse. Every single time I tried to ease the burden on the core, to loosen the restraints, the Imperial resonance grid violently destabilized. If the life support networks across 300 star systems fail simultaneously, 40 billion citizens will suffocate in a matter of hours. I had to choose the silent, horrific suffering of one ancient entity over the immediate, catastrophic extinction of my people. I was not being a tyrant. I was terrified. Micah looked at the proud, intimidating alien queen and saw nothing but a trapped mother who had carried an impossible mathematics of survival on her shoulders. He did not instantly forgive her cowardice, but the mechanic in him deeply understood the brutal logic of a catastrophic system failure. She was not a monster. She was simply trying to keep a collapsing engine running with duct tape, silence, and prayers. "I have the data we pulled from the memory nodes," Micah said, holding up his battered multi-tool. The tiny screen glowed with a faint, green light. The purged border colonies, the active sabotage on the princess's ship, Sorvain's command overrides that turned the Ascension ritual into a mass enslavement tool. It is all backed up right here. "It is entirely useless," Nisara countered, her voice heavy with bitter defeat. "The Vanguard controls the High Council and the military tribunals. They will immediately declare your human device a fabricated, malicious weapon. No aristocrat in that hall will believe an outsider branded as a biological infection over the decorated Grand Marshal. They need to hear the truth directly from the architecture itself. The palace must testify." Micah stared at his rough, calloused hands. The Velith society was fatally obsessed with immaculate order. A small screen displaying raw data was just another chaotic variable their conditioned minds would automatically filter out as an error. To break a perfect, corrupted system, you had to hit it with something entirely uncalculated. Something purely visceral, deeply emotional, and completely outside their mathematical understanding. "The very first time we met," Micah started, his mind racing as he pieced the chaotic logic together. "When she ran down the stairs and grabbed me in the main hall, the palace did not just react to my heartbeat or my vocal cadence. It reacted to the sheer, unscripted shock of the moment. It was an unfiltered, unpredictable emotional connection between a flawed human and a perfect Velith. That is the master key. It bypasses all the fake security protocols and the forced synchronization, because a genuine emotional reaction cannot be artificially replicated." Nisara's projection began to destabilize rapidly, the time limit on her secure, bypassed channel running out. "You must reach the Grand Dais. If Sorvain completes the first harmonic cycle, the Dominion loses its free will forever." "Keep the heavy doors unlocked," Micah said, gripping his spanner tightly. "I am going to crash a royal party." The upper corridors of the palace were entirely deserted. Every guard, servant, and noble drawn into the mesmerizing, terrifying gravity of the ongoing ritual. Micah slipped through the shadows of the towering archways, his heavy boots making minimal noise against the polished floors. As he reached the massive open entrance of the Great Hall, the sheer scale of the danger slammed into him. The air inside the massive chamber was practically liquid with concentrated resonance energy. 10,000 aristocrats stood frozen in immaculate rows, their eyes glassy and vacant, their individual minds being systematically overwritten by the deafening, singular tone of Sorvain's manufactured perfection. The grand floating rings above them pulsed with an angry, oppressive crimson light, slowly synchronizing the brainwaves of everyone in the room. Up on the towering, illuminated dais, Leoray was fighting a brutal war inside her own mind. The crushing weight of the absolute frequency was physically pressing down on her shoulders, attempting to flatten her consciousness into complete submission. She forced herself to play the part of the compliant vessel, bowing her head gracefully, allowing the high priests to weave the heavy, glowing ribbons of synchronization light around her arms. She was buying time, dragging out every single second of the ritual, waiting desperately for a variable she prayed was still alive in the dark below. Micah stepped out from the shadows of the entrance, moving deliberately into the blinding light of the center aisle. He wore a stained utility suit and carried a rusted wrench, He was a jagged, dirty anomaly, entirely ruining the aesthetic perfection of the monumental event. Marshal Sorvain, standing proudly at the apex of the podium, possessed reflexes honed by decades of elite, ruthless warfare. His eyes darted past the sea of compliant, hypnotized nobles and locked instantly onto the human intruder at the far end of the hall. The marshal's flawless face contorted into a mask of absolute, hateful fury. The mechanic was supposed to be erased, reduced to silent atoms in the subterranean vaults. Sorvain did not bother with elegant political theater or subtle manipulations. He recognized the profound danger of the human variable. He abandoned the ritual chant, stepped away from the altar, and pointed a heavily armored finger directly down the long crystalline aisle. "Kill the human instantly!" Sorvain roared, his commanding voice shattering the hypnotic, droning trance of the ceremony. "Sever the infection from the hall." Instantly, 24 Vanguard elite soldiers stationed around the perimeter snapped out of their ceremonial stances. Their heavy plasma rifles powered up with a terrifying, synchronized, high-pitched hum. They did not aim to capture or detain the intruder. They aimed to completely vaporize the anomaly before he could take another step. Micah froze in his tracks, staring down the glowing barrels of enough concentrated firepower to level a massive industrial space station. He had absolutely no cover, no energy shields, and no military backup. He had brought the unvarnished truth to the center of the Empire, but it was about to be burned to ash before he could even open his mouth to speak it. High up on the grand dais, Leorai snapped her head up at the sound of the marshal's furious order. She saw the heavy weapons locking onto the lone man who had pulled her from the wreckage of the plasma storm. She saw the absolute, ruthless certainty burning in Sorvain's eyes. The princess of the Velith Dominion did not calculate the intricate political fallout of her next action. She did not consider the ancient, binding traditions of her ancestors, the heavy ceremonial armor weighing her body down, or the terrifying, dangerous drop from the towering platform to the hard floor below. She operated entirely on the chaotic, beautiful, deeply flawed instinct she had learned from a grease-stained, stubborn scavenger. Before the Vanguard elites could pull their triggers and unleash the lethal barrage, Leorai violently tore the heavy ribbons of synchronization light from her arms, shattering the ritual bindings into a shower of sparks. She lunged forward, launching herself completely off the edge of the high dais. She crashed heavily through the pristine, shocked ranks of the royal guard stationed at the base of the stairs, using the heavy metal of her ceremonial gown as a battering ram. Her momentum carried her forward in a desperate, reckless sprint directly down the center aisle. Searing plasma fire erupted behind her, scorching the crystalline floorboards and shattering the ancient pillars. But she did not flinch or look back. Surrounded by the blinding, chaotic crossfire of the ruined coronation, the future queen of the Velith Empire ran directly toward the human for the second time. The searing heat of plasma fire scorched the air inches from Leorai as she collided with Micah. It was not a calculated maneuver or a strategic diplomatic gesture. It was a desperate, purely emotional collision of two vastly different species. She threw her arms around his grease-stained utility suit, burying her face against his chest exactly as she had done on the day he first arrived. The impact of that second embrace acted as a biological wrecking ball against the rigid architecture of Marshal Sorvain's grand design. The absolute synchronization protocol demanded flawless, mathematical isolation. It could not process the chaotic, unpredictable surge of genuine affection and cross-species connection. High above, the massive floating rings of the Great Hall shrieked. The oppressive crimson light that had been pressing down on the minds of 10,000 nobles shattered like cheap glass. The deafening, singular tone of the Vanguard's forced order abruptly snapped, replaced by a sound the Velith Empire had not heard in thousands of years. It was the true voice of the heart choir. It was no longer a choked, suffocating melody. It erupted from the crystalline floorboards as a torrential, roaring wave of living memory. The floor of the great hall dissolved into a vast, glowing projection of raw truth. Every aristocrat, high priest, and fleet commander was violently ripped from their hypnotic trance and plunged directly into the suppressed history of their own dominion. They did not just watch the events, they felt them. They felt the terror of the 40,000 colonists on the border worlds as their atmospheric processors were maliciously deactivated by Vanguard command codes. They experienced the sickening jolt of Lioray's organic ship being sabotaged from the inside out. Finally, they felt the cold, mechanical horror of Sorvain's ultimate plan, a future where their own minds were permanently locked into a silent, unfeeling void, reduced to biological cogs in an endless war machine. Panic and absolute outrage swept through the ranks of the nobility. The Vanguard guards, previously acting with flawless unity, suddenly broke formation, dropping their weapons as the sheer weight of their commander's betrayal crashed into their consciousness. Up on the grand dais, Marshal Sorvain refused to surrender to the chaos. His mind, forged in the fires of absolute military perfection, could not accept that an uncalculated human variable had broken his empire. Roaring in fury, he lunged toward the primary resonance pillar at the center of the altar. He slammed his bare hands against the raw, glowing nerve cluster, attempting to physically force his own supreme command codes back into the planetary core to re-establish the absolute frequency. It was a fatal miscalculation. The heart choir was no longer a chained, subdued prisoner. It was awake, and it was chaotic. When Sorvain connected his mind to the core, he was hit with the full, unbridled force of living, emotional resonance. His hyper-advanced, mathematically perfect neural architecture was completely incapable of processing the massive influx of variables, sorrow, and raw life. The Marshal screamed as the pillar flared with blinding silver light. The flawless system he had designed to conquer the Empire immediately rejected his rigid mind. In front of the entire terrified court, Sorvain's armor shattered, and the sheer force of the harmonic feedback dissolved him into a cloud of glowing, harmless ash. Silence, thick and trembling, fell over the great hall. The oppressive threat was gone, but the immense, awakened energy of the planetary core was still wildly fluctuating, vibrating the walls with an unstable intensity. It was like a starved creature suddenly given a feast, bordering on a manic overload. Queen Nisara slowly descended the stairs of the dais. She did not raise her scepter to command the room. Instead, she walked past the ashes of the Grand Marshal, approached her daughter, and did something no Velith monarch had done since the dawn of their civilization. She sank gracefully to one knee, bowing her head before Liaray and the human mechanic. The throne was never meant to be a cage, Nisara declared, her voice devoid of its usual glacial edge, filled instead with profound sorrow and newfound clarity. Our ancestors bound the core because they feared the noise of free will. We were taught that the heart choir chose the most perfect, purest bloodline to rule. We were completely wrong. She looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the swirling silver light of the liberated palace. It does not seek perfection. It seeks a bridge. It requires a leader who can look at an entity entirely alien, entirely different, and choose to embrace it rather than dominate it. That is why it answered you, Liaray. Your human brought the chaos of empathy into our pristine world, and you chose to hold on to it. That embrace was the true key to the Empire. But the cavernous hall was still shaking. The heart choir, free from its chains, was spiraling into an acoustic panic, unable to find a stable rhythm after centuries of torture. Micah gently unspooled Lioray's arms from his neck. He stepped forward, planting his heavy boots firmly on the crystalline floor. He did not possess royal blood or a brilliant, mathematically perfect mind. He was just a guy who knew how to fix things that were violently breaking apart. He placed his calloused hand flat against the vibrating floor. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to speak to the ancient entity, projecting his voice deep into the architecture. "Easy now," Micah murmured, his rough, baritone voice cutting through the ringing echoes of the grand hall. "You are free. The chains are gone. You do not have to scream anymore. Just find the baseline. Breathe with me." He began to tap his heavy wrench against the floor, a slow, steady, profoundly imperfect human rhythm. 60 beats per minute. A calm, resting heartbeat. He introduced a simple, grounded error into the overwhelming perfection of the Velith network. The massive entity beneath them listened. It grasped onto that rough, steady human cadence, like a drowning sailor grabbing a lifeline. The violent shaking of the palace walls slowly subsided. The blinding silver light softened into a warm, gentle pulse that mirrored the exact rhythm of Micah's tapping wrench. The Empire was no longer a machine forced into silence. It was a living, breathing symphony that finally knew how to harmonize with its own imperfections. Behind him, a sound swept through the hall like a falling forest. 10,000 Velith aristocrats, fleet commanders, and high priests dropped to their knees. They did not kneel in submission to a conquering army. They knelt in profound, humbling awe of a truth they had spent millennia trying to erase. A lowly, grease-stained ship mechanic from Earth had just forced the most advanced civilization in the galaxy to remember its own soul. In the weeks that followed, the Velith Dominion was fundamentally reborn. Liarai was officially recognized as the absolute heir, not by a forced ritual, but by the undeniable, joyful song of the planet itself. Queen Nisara formally stepped down, dedicating the remainder of her long life to the massive logistical effort of rebuilding the erased border colonies and dismantling the Vanguard's oppressive military infrastructure. The Grand Imperial Edicts were rewritten, publicly recognizing humanity not as a primitive nuisance, but as an indispensable, formidable ally whose inherent ability to navigate chaos was the greatest asset in the universe. As for Micah Rourke, he found himself standing in the newly restored, sunlit courtyard of the royal palace, wearing a brand-new, slightly uncomfortable diplomatic jacket over his old utility shirt. He looked up at the floating crystalline rings, which were now pulsing with a warm, lively array of unpredictable colors. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, pulling his battered multi-tool from his pocket and tossing it lightly in the air. "Next time anyone wants me to fix an entire civilization," Micah muttered to himself with a dry, knowing smirk, "they are definitely going to have to pay me a whole lot more than standard engine repair rates." Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like the video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.